Meghan Markle breaks her agreement with King Charles and Buckingham Palace to leak to her friends at People magazine less than a week after that promised meeting with Charles and Queen Camilla. He's making the point that this leak is Meghan trying to make herself the victim in all of this somehow.
Meghan Markle felt humiliated on Prince Harry's most recent UK trip, and that the trip turned into a nightmare, forcing Markle and her children to return home to California earlier than that.
Prince Harry's recent UK visit was supposed to be a quiet, low-key family reunion. Instead, it turned into one of the busiest weeks of royal news we've seen in a while. Headlines, leaks, competing narratives, and a fresh round of debate about security, money, and family relationships that still show no sign of resolution. In this video, we're going to go through everything, piece by piece. We'll look at how a private meeting somehow ended up detailed in a magazine cover story within days. We'll dig into Meghan's absence from two major events. We'll revisit the security fight that just won't go away. We'll talk about the financial pressures that some believe are quietly driving a lot of these decisions. And we'll look at where things actually stand between Harry and William, because despite all the headlines, that relationship hasn't moved much at all. As always, we're going to present both sides here. What supporters are saying, what critics are saying, because a lot of this story is still built on anonymous sources and speculation rather than confirmed fact. Let's get into it. Segment 1. The meeting that was supposed to stay private. Let's start with the meeting itself. Reports suggest that ahead of Harry's visit, there was an informal understanding between his team and the palace. No media briefings, no leaks, nothing that could be used to shape public opinion in favor of one side or the other. The idea was simple. Keep it a private family matter. That lasted less than a week. People magazine published a cover story built around Harry's visit, and it wasn't vague. It contained specific emotional details. How Meghan reportedly felt about not being by Harry's side, how the week was described as difficult and stressful behind the scenes, and details about the planning that led up to the visit. For a meeting that was supposed to stay behind closed doors, an awful lot of detail made it into print remarkably quickly. Naturally, that raised questions. If both sides had agreed not to brief the media, where exactly did this information come from? Some royal commentators have long viewed People magazine as a publication that tends to reflect the Sussex perspective, given its history of stories that seem to align closely with Harry and Meghan's point of view. Based on that pattern, some believe the details likely came from someone close to the couple, a friend, a communications contact, or someone familiar with their side of the story. Others push back on that assumption. They argue that magazines build sources over years, and that just because a story favors one side doesn't automatically mean that side leaked it. Journalists can piece together a narrative from multiple partial sources without any single individual being responsible. What we can say for certain is this: the timing looked bad. An agreement to stay private, followed almost immediately by a detailed, sympathetic cover story, is the kind of coincidence that invites scrutiny, fair or not, and it set the tone for how the rest of the week would be interpreted. Segment 2. Meghan's absence, Time 100, and the Invictus launch. Next, let's talk about Meghan's noticeable absence from two big public moments during this same period: the Time 100 event, which Harry attended solo, and the launch event marking the countdown to the 2027 Invictus Games in Birmingham, where Meghan had reportedly once been expected to attend alongside him. This didn't go unnoticed. Some commentators framed her absence as a deliberate choice, suggesting she may not have wanted to be seen publicly during a week that included a difficult legal setback for Harry. The theory goes that appearing together during a rough news cycle could have looked bad optically, so staying away was the safer option. Others argue there's no actual evidence behind that theory. Scheduling conflicts, childcare, travel logistics, or simply not wanting to attend every single event a spouse attends are all completely ordinary reasons that get overlooked when someone is already a public figure under constant scrutiny. Not every absence is a strategic decision. Sometimes it's just a normal life choice. There's also a broader pattern worth pointing out here. Whenever a well-known public figure skips an event, especially during a tense news cycle, commentary tends to assume intent. It happens with celebrities, politicians, and royals alike. Segment 4. Where Harry stayed and why it mattered. One smaller detail that generated its own mini-debate was where Harry actually stayed during this visit. Reports indicated he was not accommodated at Buckingham Palace, which some viewed as a snub, while others saw it as a sensible, practical decision. The argument for it being sensible goes like this. Harry has been publicly critical of certain institutional decisions. The courts, the government, elements of the media, during his time away from royal duties. Housing him at an official royal residence while he's making public statements critical of state institutions could create awkward optics or even raise uncomfortable questions about the palace's neutrality. The counter-argument is that family is family, and that logistics around royal residences are usually flexible enough to accommodate visiting family members regardless of their public statements. From this view, not offering that accommodation could be read as a signal of ongoing tension rather than a purely practical choice. Realistically, this is one of those details where we're unlikely to get a clear, official explanation. It's plausible either way, and reasonable people land on different conclusions depending on how they already feel about the broader situation. Segment 5. The financial angle. Is money quietly driving all of this? Let's talk about money, because a lot of commentators believe this is one of the most underappreciated parts of the whole story. Since relocating to California, Harry and Meghan built a series of high-profile commercial partnerships, production deals, media deals, brand partnerships. Several of these arrangements have reportedly changed or wound down over time. Some observers frame this as simply how the entertainment industry works. Initial interest, driven by name recognition, doesn't always translate into long-term sustained output. And that's true for plenty of public figures, not just this couple. Others take a more critical view, suggesting that as those deals become less reliable, the financial pressure of maintaining private security, ongoing legal costs, and a high-profile lifestyle becomes harder to sustain, and that rebuilding a working relationship with the royal family might carry practical benefits beyond just emotional reconciliation. It's worth being clear here. None of this is confirmed. The couple's actual finances are private, as anyone's would be, and estimates thrown around by commentators are just that. Estimates, not verified figures. Legal costs are also part of this conversation. Following a recent high-profile court case, some reports suggested Harry could be facing a substantial legal bill, potentially in the tens of millions, when combined with other parties involved in the same case. Whether insurance covers some, all, or none of, that remains unclear publicly. And it's exactly the kind of detail that fuels speculation about financial motivations behind recent decisions. The larger point commentators tend to agree on is this. Whether or not finances are actually driving any of Harry's choices, the financial pressure argument has become part of how many people now interpret every security dispute, every legal case, and every family visit. Whether that lens is accurate or not is something only Harry and his family can really answer. Segment 6. William and Harry. Still no contact. Around the same time as the People magazine story, other outlets, including reports referencing the New York Times, carried stories suggesting there's still no meaningful contact between William and Harry, and that the rift extends to the next generation, with minimal contact reported between the cousins as well. Some commentators noticed that several of these stories ran within days of each other, and questioned whether that timing reflected some kind of coordinated messaging. Others point out that major royal stories often get picked up simultaneously across multiple outlets simply because they're newsworthy, without requiring any actual coordination behind the scenes. Regardless of how these stories came together, the underlying point seems consistent across nearly every report. The relationship between the two brothers remains unresolved, at least publicly, and there's no official indication that meaningful progress has been made. Segment 7. The bigger picture. So, stepping back from all of it, what actually changed after this visit? Communication between Harry and King Charles appears to be, at minimum, open. That's not nothing, especially given everything that's happened over the past several years. But the wider picture, William, the cousins, the ongoing security dispute, the financial questions, all of that remains just as complicated as it was before Harry landed in the UK. What we're left with is a familiar pattern. A visit generates headlines. Anonymous sources shape the narrative. Commentators split into predictable camps, and neither side gets definitive answers. Until official statements replace speculation, that pattern is likely to repeat every single time Harry returns to the headlines. Segment 8. How the Palace and Team Sussex are playing this in the media. Let's talk about strategy for a moment, because a lot of what happened this week only makes sense if you look at it through the lens of media management, rather than just family dynamics. On one side, the Palace has generally preferred a strategy of silence. Buckingham Palace almost never responds directly to specific claims made in tabloid or magazine stories about the Sussexes. And that's been the pattern for years now, not just this week. Some commentators view this as a smart, disciplined approach. By refusing to engage, the Palace avoids feeding the story further and denies it the back and forth that keeps a controversy alive in the news cycle. Others argue that this same silence has repeatedly allowed one-sided narratives to dominate headlines, simply because there's no counterstatement to balance them out. On the other side, Harry and Meghan's team has taken a very different approach over the years, working with select outlets, offering background details through unnamed sources, and occasionally granting more direct interviews when they feel their side of a story needs to be told. Supporters describe this as simply exercising the same right to tell their story that any public figure has. Critics describe it as an ongoing pattern of managing public perception, while simultaneously claiming to want privacy, which they see as fundamentally contradictory. Both interpretations have been repeated so often at this point that they've almost become permanent lenses through which every single news story gets filtered, regardless of what the actual facts of that particular story turn out to be. That's worth keeping in mind as we continue to see new stories emerge in the months ahead. A lot of the reaction to any new headline is really just the continuation of opinions people already had going in, applied to whatever the newest detail happens to be. Segment 9. How the public and royal watchers reacted online. It's also worth taking a moment to look at how ordinary royal watchers reacted to all of this online, because the public conversation ended up almost as split as the commentary from professional royal correspondents. A large portion of the reaction fell into a camp that's grown increasingly skeptical of the Sussexes over the past several years, arguing that this entire episode fits a familiar pattern: private assurances given, then a favorable story emerging shortly after, followed by public sympathy being generated around Meghan specifically. For this group, the timing alone was enough to confirm what they already believed. Another sizable portion of the public reaction pushed back hard against that framing, arguing that Harry and Meghan have spent years being blamed for stories they didn't necessarily leak themselves, and that assuming leaks without direct proof is itself an unfair pattern that gets applied to this couple far more consistently than it gets applied to other royal family members involved in similarly timed stories. A smaller, quieter group of commentators took a more neutral position throughout, essentially arguing that everyone commenting on this story, on every side, is working from incomplete information, and that the healthiest response is simply to wait for more clarity, rather than forming strong conclusions based on magazine excerpts and unnamed sources. That third group tends to get drowned out in the loudest parts of the conversation, but it's worth remembering that their point holds up better than either extreme once you actually step back from the noise. Comparing this visit to Harry's past UK trips, it's also useful to put this visit in context by comparing it to some of Harry's previous trips back to the UK over the past few years, because a lot of the same debates have played out before, almost beat for beat. Previous visits have followed a strikingly similar pattern. Anticipation builds beforehand, about whether there will be a meeting with Charles or William. Security arrangements become a major talking point. In the days leading up to the trip, the visit itself often passes with fewer dramatic incidents than expected, and then a wave of post-visit reporting fills in details about what supposedly happened behind closed doors. This visit largely followed that exact same script. Some commentators argue this repetition actually tells us something important, that these visits have settled into a fairly predictable rhythm, and that expecting any single trip to dramatically shift the underlying relationships is probably unrealistic, given how consistently that hasn't happened in the past. Others argue that even small, incremental progress matters over time, and that dismissing every visit as more of the same ignores the fact that the relationship between Harry and Charles does appear to have shifted somewhat compared to a few years ago, even if the relationship with William hasn't moved at all. Where you land on that question probably depends on whether you're looking for a single dramatic turning point or whether you're willing to measure progress in smaller, slower increments over a period of years rather than expecting a decisive resolution from any one visit. Segment 11. What happens next? So where does this actually leave things going forward? On the security front, expect this exact dispute to resurface the next time Harry visits the UK, because nothing about the underlying legal and procedural questions has actually been resolved. Only the immediate news cycle has moved on. Any further legal developments, whichever direction they go, will almost certainly reignite the same debate we just walked through. On the family relationship front, most commentators agree that any real change with William would likely happen quietly, away from cameras and unnamed sources entirely, rather than through another high-profile visit or a dramatic public reconciliation moment. If that relationship does improve, it's more likely we'll notice it retroactively, through a gradual softening in how the two brothers are described in future reporting, rather than through any single announced event. On the financial front, the coming months around any further legal proceedings, along with news about future business ventures, will likely keep this narrative going, regardless of what Harry and Meghan actually intend. Once a financial pressure narrative attaches itself to a public figure's story, it tends to get applied to nearly everything that follows, fair or not. That's our full breakdown of this week's biggest royal story. What's your take? Do you think this visit actually brought Harry and his family closer together, or did it just add another layer to an already complicated situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, share it with someone who follows the royals, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the biggest royal and celebrity stories.